John McGurk is the editor of the Irish website Gript, which is a terrific publication that I commend to you, and I particularly commend his piece on this very topic. John, you wrote just a few days ago about one of the weirder aspects of this new war, which is the way these new global corporations are leading the charge at sticking it to the Russians.
I did, Mark. I think it's fascinating. Obviously, people have strong views on the Russian-Ukraine war, as I do. I mean, I find Vladimir Putin's behavior to be historically awful. But at the same time, I think when these things happen, it's important sometimes to observe what's happening in the world and the way it's happening. And one of the things that I found particularly interesting, and have found particularly interesting watching over the last couple of weeks, has been the way so many global corporations, for the first time that I can remember, or not being that old, recall from recent history, corporations have been majorly involved in leading the charge to effectively, as you said, cancel Russia. Now, you can, as I do, think that cancellation is well deserved, while still being a little bit perturbed at the manner and the power that is on display. Because, you know, we live in a world now where a couple of companies that are, firstly, not democracies, secondly, not accountable to any real political power when you're a globe-spanning corporation, have the power to effectively isolate and banjax, to use an Irish word, the economy of the world's second or third military power. It's an astonishing state of affairs. And what I think we should be thinking about, I want to connect it very briefly, if you don't mind, to something else. If you look at in the US, the story about the Hunter Biden laptop, where we now know, for example, that Facebook and Twitter explicitly suppressed a news story that was true in order to help a political candidate they favored in the largest democracy in the world. I think when you look at those two things, I mean, when I was a kid, we used to read dystopian novels about the future where the world was no longer governed by the people, but by a bunch of megacorps. And I think we're probably, we're not quite there yet, but we're closer to that becoming a reality at this point in human history than we've been really since the days of you know, the American Industrial Revolution and the railroad magnates.
Yep. Well, I think it's actually more than that. You know, since you bring up the railroad magnates, the rap on corporations, particularly from the left, is that they're just all about money. They're only interested in money, which is how traditionally they behave. I mean, if you go back, whatever it is now, 85 years, I think it is, to when the Irish Free State introduced the Control of Manufactures Act. And as you may recall, Guinness upped and moved its corporate headquarters from Dublin to London. And that doesn't reflect any particular position on the merits of Ireland or England. Guinness was just thinking about the bottom line. And in some strange way, I'm slightly disturbed by the fact that these new kinds of corporations aren't thinking about the bottom line. They're taking what purports to be a moral stance, but also an ideologically, politically activist stance, which would have been thought totally weird back in when Guinness made that decision.
That is, we share that view. The most disturbing thing is that we live in an era of progressive cultural imperialism, whereby there is one approved line of thought on almost every hot button topic of the day. I saw the other day. I don't want to hang on censorship too often, but the Babylon Bee, an American satirical website which awarded one of Joe Biden's transgender cabinet secretaries the title of Man of the Year, was banned by Twitter and other social media platforms on the basis, I think, that it had, I know that it had offended against the established line of thought on the issue of gender, which is that there are as many genders as there are stars in the sky. And I think that when you combine that dominant progressive cultural imperialism, which says you shall not disagree with us on these issues and remain a member of polite society, with the corporate power to cancel whole countries, which we now have, you live in a very dangerous society. And I would wonder, to speculate, for example, what might become next of countries like Poland and Hungary that have distinctive political lines on these issues, or what might happen to the UK government if, for example, Boris Johnson ever decided to reverse his government's policy on gender self-recognition. At that point, do the corporate overlords in California, in Silicon Valley, in the face of pressure, not from their shareholders, but just from their employees, that's another interesting thing, it's employee power now in these companies, decide to retaliate against the British state, for example? It's not as unthinkable as that would have been even 6 months ago. And I think these things are, one of the things we're constantly seeing is the unthinkable 6 months ago becoming the reality today. And the pace at which the acquisition of power from these companies is advancing is incredible. If you go back to a year and a bit ago, it would, I think, have been unconscionable. Nobody would have imagined that a group of American companies would come together, for good or ill, to effectively muzzle the sitting president of the United States, which they did. I mean, at the time, the president of the United States, and by the way, so we're clear, by the way, I wouldn't have voted for him. But he was the sitting president of the United States, and they took away his power to communicate with the public and left it entirely in the hands of their corporate-owned media companies. And that is an astonishing extension of corporate power. And now, less than a year later, we're seeing these same companies extend that power to directly interfere in international events by effectively, in my view, correctly, but the power is still remarkable, cancel a country. And when you have these threats in society, I wonder what the next frontier is, because it's coming.
Well, I think there is the next frontier, because, as you say, at the same time as these companies, Western multinationals, have waged this blitzkrieg on Russia. At the same time, we have this campaign in the West against oligarchs. And oligarchs aren't really that different from, say, the Zuckerberg at Facebook or the guy at Twitter. Not really. They just happen to be Russians who have a ton of money. And because they have the wrong political views, everyone's going around confiscating their yachts and their football clubs, as in the case of Chelsea. And that in itself is slightly weird to me. In America, the proposed legislation under which this is being done explicitly eschews any mention of Russia and says that Joe Biden can, in fact, do this to anybody. So that on the one hand, he can seize an oligarch's super yacht, but on the other hand, he can take your Ford Cortina if he's minded to do so. This is also disturbing, I think.
There's a huge danger here, and I mean, nobody understands the anger people feel about what's happening in Ukraine better than I. It's utterly appalling. But sometimes when these things are happening, and our emotions get very head up, we throw the baby out, to use an old phrase, with the bathwater. I mean, I've seen things mooted, for example, like the idea of taking the Russian government's foreign reserves, effectively stealing them and using them to rebuild Ukraine, which is an idea that feels on the face of it completely just. That seems like a really just thing to do. The difficulty is we do not know what long-term, medium-term effect that will have on confidence in currency markets, reserves, the whole basis of our economic system. If governments can just seize assets belonging to people and other countries on the basis of political disagreements, there's huge danger there that we're not thinking about. And it's being combined with this. We are already in a culture where we have very powerful companies that all have the same political viewpoint, by and large, on the issues of the day, not necessarily economics. It's very odd. They don't care what your VAT rate is necessarily, but they really do care what your laws on abortion or gay marriage or euthanasia are, which I find extraordinary. But when you have all those political views that are effectively homogenized, and you place in those people's hands the power to silence individuals, including the most powerful elected individual in the world, and shut down trade. I mean, if you look at, we're talking a lot about Facebook and Twitter, but if you look at what Maersk did, the global shipping company, when they announced that they wouldn't allow their containers to be used in Russian ports, I mean, that shatters Russia's power to trade with anybody, even a country that hasn't placed sanctions on it. And it's being done from a corporate boardroom. And this is the important point, a corporate boardroom that is not elected by anybody. It is accountable to nobody. Yeah. The only people it's accountable to are its shareholders, who, ironically, to bring back to your point about oligarchs, are largely across these major companies a small group of major investment firms controlled by the same people. I'm not a conspiracy theorist or anything like that, but it's interesting how many of these major corporations have the same small group of major shareholders, and how much power, political power, economic power in the West is concentrated in the hands of a very small number of people. So it's easy and right, by the way, to look at Russia and look at the kleptocracy that country is. I don't think the West is a kleptocracy, but we have some of the same patterns over here that I think, if we wish to avoid going down that road of untrammeled political power, we would be wanting to look at curbing.